7 signs God is removing toxic people from your life. There are moments when your life begins to feel quieter. Not because everything is finally perfect, but because something heavy has been lifted. Certain conversations stop happening. Certain names stop appearing on your phone. Certain relationships that once demanded constant energy begin to fade. And while part of you feels relief, another part feels guilt, confusion, and even grief. You wonder if you did something wrong. You question whether you should have tried harder. You ask yourself why distance had to come this way. The Bible shows us that God is deeply involved in our relationships, not only in who He brings into our lives, but also in who He removes. And often when God begins to separate us from people, it doesn't happen through confrontation or dramatic endings. It happens quietly, slowly, almost gently, until one day you realize that what once had a strong hold on you no longer does. This process can be painful, because separation always carries loss, even when the relationship was unhealthy. You may miss the familiarity. You may grieve what you hoped the relationship could become. And at the same time, you may feel an unexpected sense of peace you can't explain. That tension is where many people struggle. They assume that if God were involved, it wouldn't hurt this much. But Scripture reveals that God's protection does not always feel gentle in the moment. It often feels like pruning. Toxic relationships don't always look obvious. Sometimes they hide behind loyalty, history, shared pain, or obligation. Sometimes they are normalized for so long that you stop noticing how drained you've become. God sees what you've tolerated. He sees how certain people affect your peace, your faith, your confidence, and your ability to hear His voice. And when those relationships begin to interfere with the life He's shaping in you, God doesn't ignore it. If you've noticed distance forming that you didn't force, if you felt peace growing where there was once chaos, if you found it harder to reconnect with people who once had access to you, this message is not here to shame you or make you suspicious of everyone. It's here to help you recognize when God may be stepping in to protect your heart. Sometimes God removes people not because you are better than them, but because you are becoming different. And learning to recognize the signs of that separation can help you release guilt, trust God's process, and move forward without bitterness. Number 1, peace begins to replace the chaos they brought. One of the first signs that God is removing toxic people from your life is the return of peace, often before you fully understand why it has come. You may not have had a final conversation. There may not have been a clear ending, but suddenly the constant tension eases. Your thoughts feel quieter. Your emotions feel less reactive. You are no longer bracing yourself before interactions or replaying conversations long after they end. This peace can feel confusing at first, because it arrives alongside loss. You may still care about the person. You may still remember good moments. Yet the absence of chaos is undeniable. Scripture teaches that God is a God of peace, not confusion. When peace increases as distance grows, it is often a sign that something unhealthy was disrupting your inner life. Toxic relationships often normalize stress. You get used to feeling anxious, guarded, or emotionally exhausted, and you mistake that state for normal connection. God, however, does not ask His people to live in constant emotional turbulence. When He begins removing someone from your life, peace becomes a form of confirmation, not that everything is resolved, but that something damaging has been interrupted. This peace is not indifference. It is relief. Relief from explaining yourself. Relief from emotional manipulation. Relief from the pressure to manage someone else's instability. God allows you to feel this peace, so you can recognize the weight you are carrying without realizing it. If you've noticed that life feels calmer since certain people became less present, don't rush to fill that space with guilt. Peace is not a betrayal of love. It is often evidence of God restoring what was being drained. When peace replaces chaos, it is one of the clearest signs that God is protecting your heart by creating distance. Number 2. Conversations with them start to feel draining instead of life-giving. Another sign that God is removing toxic people from your life is the shift in how interactions with them affect you. Conversations that once felt familiar now feel heavy. Instead of leaving encouraged or understood, you walk away feeling exhausted, unsettled, or diminished. You may not be able to point to anything overtly wrong, but something consistently feels off. The Bible speaks often about the power of words and influence. God designed relationships to strengthen, sharpen, and support. When a relationship begins to consistently drain rather than nourish, it is no longer functioning as it should. God allows this awareness to grow so that you can recognize what your soul has been absorbing. At first, you may resist this realization. You tell yourself you're being too sensitive. You remind yourself of shared history. You excuse behavior out of loyalty or compassion. But the exhaustion persists. God is not condemning the other person. He is clarifying the impact they have on you. Toxic dynamics often reveal themselves through repetition. The same conversations, the same emotional weight, the same sense that you are giving more than you are receiving. God uses this pattern to awaken discernment. He helps you see that love does not require constant depletion. If you've noticed that interactions with certain people consistently leave you tired, guarded, or unsettled, pay attention. This is not selfishness. It is awareness. God is teaching you to recognize which connections align with the life He is shaping in you and which ones quietly undermine it. When conversations become draining instead of life-giving, it is often because God is loosening a bond that no longer serves your spiritual or emotional health. That discomfort is not cruelty. It is clarity. Number 3. God strengthens your boundaries without you forcing them. One of the most revealing signs that God is removing toxic people from your life is that boundaries begin to form without constant effort. You're no longer rehearsing what to say. You're no longer bracing yourself before responding. You're no longer forcing distance through willpower alone. Instead, space begins to exist naturally. This can feel strange, especially if you've spent years being the one who overextends, explains, or accommodates. You may notice that you no longer feel compelled to answer immediately, justify your choices, or smooth over discomfort, not because you've grown cold, but because something within you has grown clearer. The Bible shows us that God is a God of order, not chaos. When He strengthens boundaries, He does so to protect what He is forming. Toxic relationships often thrive where boundaries are weak, unclear, or consistently violated. God does not always remove people through confrontation. Sometimes He simply gives you the strength to stop overreaching. What makes this sign unmistakable is the absence of guilt. You may still feel compassion, but the shame that once accompanied distance begins to fade. God is teaching you that boundaries are not rejection, they are stewardship. You are learning to guard your peace, your energy, and your calling. This strengthening doesn't make you harsh. It makes you honest. You stop overpromising. You stop absorbing responsibility that isn't yours. And in doing so, you begin to recognize how much of your exhaustion came from trying to hold together what God was already loosening. If you've noticed that boundaries feel easier than they used to, that distance no longer requires explanation, take note. God may be doing the quiet work of separation not to harden your heart, but to protect it. When boundaries strengthen without force, it is often because God Himself is holding the line for you. Number 4. Their influence over your decisions begins to weaken. Another sign that God is removing toxic people from your life is the diminishing power of their influence. Decisions that once revolved around their reactions no longer do. You stop filtering choices through their approval. Their opinions begin to carry less weight, not because you dismiss them, but because they no longer define you. This shift can feel unsettling at first. You may realize how much space their voice once occupied in your mind, how often You hesitated, doubted, or delayed because of how they might respond. God allows this awareness to surface not to shame you, but to free you. Scripture teaches that God alone should guide our steps. When another person's influence begins to rival God's voice, something must change. God weakens unhealthy influence gradually, so that independence does not feel rebellious, but responsible. You may notice that decisions feel clearer now. You trust your discernment more. You seek God's guidance instead of reassurance from someone who once dominated your choices. This clarity is not arrogance, it is alignment. God is reclaiming authority over your direction. If you found that certain people no longer sway your decisions the way they once did, that you feel less pressure to explain or defend your path, this is not coincidence. God is gently disentangling you from dependence that limited your growth. When influence weakens, freedom grows. And that freedom allows you to walk forward without fear, guilt, or second-guessing. God removes toxic influence not to isolate you, but to restore your ability to hear Him clearly. Number 5, you feel grief, but not regret. One of the most confusing signs that God is removing toxic people from your life is the presence of grief without regret. You miss the person. You remember shared history. Certain moments still carry emotional weight. And yet beneath the sadness there is no desire to return to how things were. That absence of regret can feel unsettling, especially if you associate love with longing. The Bible shows us that grief does not always mean something was meant to stay. Sometimes grief is simply the acknowledgement that something mattered, even if it was no longer healthy. God does not require bitterness to justify separation. He allows you to mourn without pulling you back. This kind of grief is quiet. It doesn't demand action. It doesn't push you to fix or reconnect. It simply honors what was, while accepting what cannot continue. God uses this form of grief to heal attachment without reopening wounds. Toxic relationships often entangle emotions deeply. You may have invested years, loyalty, patience, and hope. Letting go of that investment hurts. But when God is removing someone from your life, He often allows grief to coexist with clarity. You can acknowledge the loss while recognizing the peace that followed it. If you find yourself missing someone but not wishing to return to the relationship, pay attention. That emotional clarity is not coldness. It is healing. God is helping you release without resentment, which protects your heart from bitterness and keeps your spirit soft. Grief without regret is a sign that God is doing careful work. He is closing a chapter gently, not violently. And that gentleness is often proof that the separation is guided by love, not by anger or fear. Number 6. God brings clarity about patterns you once excused. Another powerful sign that God is removing toxic people from your life is the clarity that comes after distance. Things you once explained away begin to look different. Behaviors you justified out of loyalty or compassion become easier to name. Patterns that felt confusing suddenly make sense. This clarity rarely comes while you are still deeply entangled. God often waits until space exists before revealing the full picture, not to shame you, but to protect you from staying longer than necessary. Distance sharpens discernment. You may look back and realize how often you minimized your own needs, ignored your intuition, or tolerated behavior that quietly harmed you. This realization can bring sadness, but it also brings understanding. God is not condemning your past decisions. He is teaching you how to recognize unhealthy patterns so they don't repeat. Scripture emphasizes wisdom and discernment as gifts that grow with experience. God uses clarity not to harden you, but to strengthen you. You begin to trust your perception more. You stop questioning whether you were too sensitive or overreacting. The confusion lifts. If you've noticed that certain relationships make more sense now that you have distance, Don't rush to revisit them. That clarity is a gift. God is showing you what you could not see while emotionally involved. When patterns become clear, God is not reopening the door. He is confirming why it needed to close. This understanding brings peace, not resentment, and it equips you to move forward with discernment, protecting the healthier relationships God is preparing to place in your life. Number 7. New peace and healthier relationships begin to appear. One of the final and most confirming signs that God is removing toxic people from your life is what begins to grow in the space they leave behind. Not immediately and not always dramatically, but steadily. Peace settles where tension once lived. Healthier connections begin to form without force. You find yourself breathing more freely, engaging more honestly, and trusting more deeply. This new peace is not dependent on someone else changing. It exists because something unhealthy has been removed. The Bible shows us that God prunes not to empty our lives, but to prepare them for growth. When toxic influence is gone, room is created for relationships that reflect mutual respect, encouragement, and alignment. You may notice that new people enter your life who don't demand explanation or emotional labor. Conversations feel balanced. There is space for difference without conflict. God does not replace toxic relationships with perfection, but He replaces strain with health. Sometimes the change is internal before it is external. You relate differently. You listen without fear. You give without overextending. God uses this season to retrain your expectations, teaching you what healthy connection feels like so you don't settle for less again. If you've begun to experience peace, clarity, or even joy where there was once constant stress, don't dismiss it. This is not coincidence. It is confirmation. God often affirms separation not by what He takes away, but by what He restores. When healthier relationships begin to appear, or when peace becomes your companion even in solitude, it is a sign that God has been protecting you all along. What felt like loss was preparation. What felt like loneliness was alignment. And what felt like separation was actually an act of love. Conclusion: sometimes God removes people to save you. When God removes people from your life, it is rarely because He wants to hurt you. More often, it is because He wants to heal you. The Bible reminds us that God cares deeply about the condition of our hearts, our peace, and our ability to walk in His purpose. And sometimes, preserving those things requires separation. You may never receive full closure. Some people will leave without explanation. Some relationships will end without reconciliation. But that does not mean God has abandoned you in the process. It often means He has stepped in quietly to protect you from harm you were no longer meant to carry. Releasing toxic relationships does not require bitterness. It requires trust. Trust that God sees what you cannot. Trust that distance can be an answer to prayer. Trust that peace is not selfish. It is sacred. If this message reflects something happening in your life, allow yourself to let go without guilt. You are not disloyal for choosing health. You are not unloving for honoring boundaries. You are not wrong for growing beyond what once held you. God removes people not to isolate you, but to align you. And what He removes, He replaces with something better suited for the life He is shaping in you. If this message helped you recognize God's hand in your relationships, share it with someone who may be struggling with distance or loss. And if you want more messages that bring biblical clarity, healing, and encouragement, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Sometimes the greatest protection God gives is not what He adds to your life, but what He lovingly removes.